in public debate, and influence political decisions that shape our society. Thank you. Welcome, Danny.
Hello, everyone. Hello. Can you guys hear me well? Thank you so much for having me here today. I just first want to ask a quick question. How many of you have seen the ocean before? Can you raise your hand? Great. How many of you have walked in the beach? How many of you have seen a dead fish? How many of you have seen fishermen? Amazing. What about, how many of you have gone diving with a beluga whale? Oh. How about swimming or diving with a minke whale? So, when people ask me this question, how to influence, I usually want to focus on what we're influencing and how. As you guys can see, it is very easy to see the ocean just through a fishing or just through a human vision of the ocean. But many little times do we actually see the ocean through the eyes of biodiversity. As you guys saw, everyone in the room mostly saw fishermen and have probably met fishermen, but many little of you have actually seen the living creatures that make up the ocean that we're defending. So sometimes I focus the question on how do we maintain biodiversity as a central point on influencing in ocean decision. And I think that's the question that I like to also focus a little bit today. First, the question that I ask you guys. I have been part of the Peruvian delegation for the UNFCCC COP climate change negotiations since Madrid. I've been part of the Peruvian delegation for more than 6 COPs already. I've also been part of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity negotiations. I've been part of the Peruvian delegation. I've been part of the French delegation and also the Panamanian delegation as a youth. I've also been part of the UNOC, United Nations Ocean Conference, in the past 2 conferences as also part of the Peruvian delegation. Here we had, this was 2 weeks ago when we went to Panama to negotiate the first marine protected area in international waters that will be proposed under the new BBNJ treaty. And I've also been influencing the BBNJ discussions in Peru and trying to get the ratifications. This is where a Minister of Environment when we're trying to position BBNJ in the country. I've also been an advisor for Veronica Mendoza, our last Peruvian presidential candidate, where I was her only youth advisor in her presidential campaign, where we traveled all around the country and we actually announced the first deep sea mining moratorium priority as a country if she was going to be elected. Sadly, she didn't get elected, but afterwards I started working with the Congress in Peru with Ed Malaga, where we introduced the first deep sea bed mining bill moratorium in Latin America. I've worked many times with MPA creation. This was an event that we organized in Congress. We led the first expedition in the tropical sea of Peru, and also been part of the ISA, the International Seabed Authority negotiations on the past 9 negotiations. So I think the question on how do we influence is something that I constantly ask myself. Because many times people are like, young people is like, we need to be included, we need to participate, and I agree 100%. And that's the role of adults to figure out. But once we're in the room, we need to ask ourselves constantly, how are we actually influencing? Are we actually changing the decisions? Are we putting biodiversity at the center again? Or are we playing the same games that previous generations have normalized? So what is influence? So can one of you probably tell me what you think influence is, in a sense? Is sitting in an event influence? What about changing the view of things? One of the ways that I want to give you an example of influence is through these points. I constantly challenge myself in the changing narrative perspectives. How can I go to a place and change narratives? How do I ask questions that others avoid? How do we introduce issues that adults have or institutions have normalized? And how do we push biodiversity and future generations into the rooms where it's not talked about? And most of the time, we become the uncomfortable person in the room. For example, I've worked many times with local communities in Peru, and it's very easy in the northern part of Peru, communities that have been 500 years old, to go in a place as a young person and see issues that they have completely normalized. For example, shark finning, a practice that is completely normal in Peru in the fishing docks. No one questions, and no NGO wants to talk about it, even though our shark populations are declining at drastic levels. We have a hammerhead reproduction zone in Peru, and it actually connects to Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, and Ecuador. But in all these other countries, they're 100% protected. But in Peru, they're 100% allowed to be fished. So even if they protect Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Panama, this whole area, the population of hammerheads is going to go down, because in the northern part of Peru, all the baby hammerheads and the female pregnant ones are being killed, because we're allowing people to just do that, because the system doesn't want to be uncomfortable to the things. So like I was mentioning, participation is not the same as power. We need to strategize when we go in the room about asking these questions. For example, my topic of just coming here, when I initially arrived in Norway, was whaling. You guys know that Norway does whaling, right? This year there's been 1,600 whales that have been put in a quota for fishing. Whales are mostly pregnant because they're slower, because they're closer to the coast to prevent predators, and it's happening over here. But it has been normalized completely. I hear views that it's because of tradition, hear views because it's economically needed, but still it's a pressure to biodiversity. And all the measures that we need for biodiversity are always going to be socially uncomfortable first. And this is something that we need to accept. If we really care about biodiversity, if we really care about the creatures, we need to accept that we're going to be socially uncomfortable for a while. Just like you were mentioning to me today about smoking, for example. It was not socially acceptable at first when there were laws about it. The same thing happened when whaling was occurring in Peru and Chile. We used to do whaling. We had whaling communities. But in 1986, we said we're not doing it anymore. Communities protested, communities were upset. We had reduced our whaling population to 1%. We have recovered most of our whales by now, thanks to this ban on whaling. Even thought it was uncomfortable. And I have this friend, her name is Sylvia Earle, and she was telling me, when we banned whaling, when we were talking about it first, everyone told me, you're such a radical. You know what they call me now? Visionary. You were so visionary. Young people need to be called radical today, because in the future, you're going to be called visionaries when you think about biodiversity. Because decision making has always been around human comfort, around economy, and we have romanticized traditions. We can bring, and we should bring, perspective of the living world, of the biodiversity back into the discussions. Thank you.
Then we will open up for questions. If anyone you can always raise your hand if there's anything. If not, then Christina, do we have any questions from Mentimeter?
Yes, as you can see, there is a lot of young people here today. So what is your number one advice for them to start creating an impact on the environment?
I think reading is essential. I think reading science is actually what gives us the views that we don't constantly live around. I think we're the first generation, you guys are the first generations to actually understand the concepts, ecological concepts. Did you guys know the concept of extinction? It started in 1786. Before that, most Europeans didn't even know that species could go extinct. When Georges Cuvier talked about extinction the first time, people laughed at him at a scientific conference in France. They said, it's impossible for a species to disappear because there's a God and he will never allow that. Today we know that more than 99% of species have gone extinct throughout world history. The concept, for example, of planetary limits, 2012. You guys are the first generation to understand planetary limits. The concept of invasive species, 1976. The concept of predators, just 1912, actually finally got stood. Naming species, 1712. So we're the first generation to actually comprehend things. We're the first generation to understand that not only are we not a divine creature, but we're actually primates, and to accept that. Still, there are previous generations that do not accept that. So we need to be led by science and by the ecological concepts, and we do that by reading and by trying to represent life in all senses.
Thank you very much.